everything was going to go and how it was going to be arranged and like that.
As an aside, have you seen the new movie, You've Got Mail?
I haven't seen it.
Do you know there's a children's book buyer featured in it?
No, didn't know that.
Jill, thanks for joining us here and telling us about your job here at Book People.
You're welcome.
This is the view from the children's section at Book TV. You can see the C-SPAN school bus out there. We're live all day today, and this is what the inside is and where a lot of the authors come and talk to kids in the children's section, book section here at Book People bookstore in Austin, Texas. And joining us here on our set is Ken Anderson. He is the author of a children's book and also a public official. Hello.
Hi, Connie.
What's your daytime job?
My daytime job is I'm the district attorney of Williamson County,
And
which is immediately to the north of here.
What cities does it include?
Georgetown and Round Rock. We're the home of Dell Computers corporate headquarters and soon to be Nolan Ryan's AA baseball club.
Why did you write a children's book?
I wrote a children's book because I was going to write a biography about Dan Moody. And I've written legal books before, but this was going to be a general audience book. Dan Moody was the district attorney of my county 75 years before me. And we knew, had been involved with fighting the Ku Klux Klan, but there was very little information about that. And so I looked at a few history books and realized nobody had ever done anything on this. And so I began to research it, and after 6 months of researching it, I found this incredibly interesting story. I found an incredibly interesting person who had never been written about, and an incredibly interesting period of time. And at that point, I was still planning on writing a 400-page standard biography, which someday I may write. But I do a lot of talking to kids, and I was talking to a group of fifth graders one day, and we actually were doing a mock trial for them in the courthouse. And their bus was late, so I had 30 minutes to kill, and I started to tell the teacher good luck and walk back to my office. And I thought, well, I'm so excited about this story, why don't I just tell it to a group of fifth graders? And I did, and they were mesmerized, and it just clicked on me. Why should I write a biography which will have relatively small readership when I could write a kid's story that kids would love? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, why not go that route? And so I got a hold of a publisher, and I found out there was a recognized segment called the 10 to 14-year-old middle readers, and that sounded like about what I should be writing for, and the kind of kids that would be able to appreciate a hero story that was true, but also be able to deal with issues like hate and prejudice and violence. And so it just sort of evolved, and I got a hold of the publisher with a proposal, and he accepted it within days. And it's...
How long has it been out?
It's been out since this past March, so we're not quite out a year, and it's just been really interesting because when you write for kids, you get to go talk to kids. And even though I've presented this to maybe 3 dozen adult audiences, I presented it to at least that many children's audiences. And the adults enjoy it, but the kids, it's just really great to get them involved in discussing these issues and talking about this thing and talking about what a hero is, an American hero, and the way the American system was able to respond to a really terrible threat, the Ku Klux Klan, back in the 1920s.
Why do you think children respond to that more than adults now?
I think at that age they're ready to start hearing some things that are a little different than maybe what they heard in elementary school, and by 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, they want to know what really happened in history. And the Ku Klux Klan back in the 1920s is a terribly dark period of American history. But it did create some heroes, and one of the very first heroes was Dan Moody, who at a time where nobody was standing up to the Ku Klux Klan, got the very first conviction in the country back in the 1920s against a Klansman. And actually, it was a series of 4 trials. And those convictions ultimately led to the Klan declining in Texas before it declined in the rest of the country. And Moody was rewarded ultimately by being elected governor of the state, the youngest governor in the history of the state.
When was this picture taken of him?
That would have been probably right as he was running for governor, probably 1925 or 1926, when he would have bat 30 perhaps.
Where was he from?
He was born in Taylor, which is a small Williamson County farm community. At that time was actually the largest community in Williamson County, and it was probably the most important inland cotton port in the United States. He was born there, raised there, lived in the same house, which is now the Moody Museum. Ultimately went to the University of Texas, didn't finish, but they say they gave him a law degree. He passed the bar exam and set up shop, and had no reason to ever be a national figure or a governor of this state. He had developed a good record as a trial lawyer and probably would have had a career as a trial lawyer, except he came directly into confrontation with the Ku Klux Klan because of an incident that happened when he was district attorney.
What were his politics?
His politics probably were much like most Texans at that time, relatively conservative. There was only one political party, the Democrats. And to the extent that he was interested, he was mainly interested in local people and politicians and local personalities. He became county attorney probably in part to develop his law practice. But at the time that he was county attorney, one of the things that the Ku Klux Klan was doing was organizing, and they had an extremely successful marketing campaign where the Kliegels of the Klan would go and organize communities. And the Klan, the 1920s version, which actually began in 1915, didn't really become very popular until 1920, when the leader of the Klan realized his ideas weren't spreading fast enough and hired an ad agency. And they developed this incredible multi-level marketing scheme where they literally went out and organized community after community, paying very handsome commissions to the salesmen, the Kliegels, that were organizing. And one of the ways they would organize, and in Texas almost exclusively, was the Kliegel would come to a community and he would enlist the support of the public officials. He would say, I'm in favor of law and order, we're in favor of 100% Americanism, and that after World War I was a very responsive thing, a very popular thing to be saying. And generally they would enlist some public officials, and then they would don Klan regalia on Sunday, march into the biggest church in the community. They would already have well-researched the most deserving charity case in the community, and the Klan would march in, walk up to the preacher with an envelope stuffed with small bills, and say, this is for the widow Jones or whoever they had determined would be sympathetic in the community. And they would lead the congregation in a hymn, and they would march out. Now, in the days before radio and TV, you can imagine when the Klan did this, having already gotten the opinion leaders of the community signed up, and then did this in the church. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, there wasn't a soul in the community that didn't know about the Ku Klux Klan. And they would typically they had to have 100 members for a cross burning and an initiation. And they would typically do that within a week and move on to the next community. They, within 6 months of coming to Texas, had 100 chapters, all the way from Beaumont to El Paso and Amarillo to Brownsville, and quickly continued to the point where they had over 100,000 members of the Klan. Moody, however, having been brought up by some relatively strict parents and with some really basic values, when the Klan came to tell him as county attorney that he was going to be one of the charter members of Taylor, looked at the man, the Kliegel, in the eye and said, I'm understanding that you're involved with vigilante violence. And the Kliegel was a good salesman and talked about some other things, but ultimately Moody handed him his hat and told him to hit the street, to which the Kliegel's response was, well, you're county attorney now, but after the next election you won't be.
Was he?
He not only was, but Moody had a little arrogant streak about him, and he actually went around town and said, the county attorney, which just represented Williamson County, I'm not sure there will be a lawyer in Williamson County who will run against me. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do is run for district attorney. And at that time, the district was both Williamson and Travis County. And Moody basically said, maybe if I have 2 counties, they can find a lawyer to run against me. In the interim, the district attorney before him resigned, largely because of a terrible incident which happened about 10 blocks from this building. It was a murder in broad daylight committed by the Klan, and they were unable to solve it, largely because the sheriff of Travis County and the police chief of Austin were Klansmen and would not cooperate.
You're talking about 10 blocks from this building that we're sitting in right now?
Yes, ma'am. The DA, after 6 months of hard work, was unable to get an indictment and resigned, and then Governor Neff appointed Moody just before the 1922 election. Moody, however, had a good reputation, and the lawyers of the community did not oppose him. And so despite his opposition to the Klan, he was elected without opposition to remain in office as district attorney in 1922. Now, 22 was a watershed year for the Klan in Texas because they had developed 100,000 members. Those 100,000 members were then ready to exercise their political power. And there were a few sheriffs and there were a few DAs around the state who had stood up to them prior to the 22 election. They took over the courthouses and the city governments of every single major county in Texas. They controlled Dallas, they controlled Fort Worth, they controlled Houston, they controlled San Antonio, they controlled El Paso, and they controlled most of Austin after the 1922 elections. Dan Moody was probably the only district attorney who was known to be opposed to the Klan who survived the 1922 elections.
And you have the same seat that he did in terms of district attorney
And
today.
I just have the honor of having the same seat. It's
Is there a Klan in Texas today?
the 1920s Klan, of course, is so different than what you and I think of as the Klan. I mean, we think of the Civil Rights Klan, the 1960s and 70s, and the very small remnants we have of an organized Klan now. The 20s Klan was totally different. The 20s Klan had 5 million members nationwide. They controlled senators. They controlled state houses. They controlled state legislatures. You know, they'd literally taken over the state of Indiana, and they had significant influence all over the country. The 20s Klan, of course, wasn't confined to the South. It was just as active in Maine and New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and the Midwest as it was in the Deep South. And it was a very political group. There's a section in Profiles in Courage by John Kennedy where he talks about the power of the Klan back at the 24 Democratic Convention and how they literally were able to block somebody from the presidential nomination. They had so much power. And Kennedy goes on to describe how one of the people stood up to them.
Ken Anderson is the author of this book, You Can't Do That, Dan Moody. It is a children's book, ages 10 to 14, or young adults. Maybe that's more of the description of it. And we're going to open up our phone lines if you would like to join us for this segment. If you live in the East or Central Time Zone, 202-624-1111. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific Time Zone, 202-624-1115. We'll take our first call from Mr. Anderson from Round Rock, Texas. Go ahead.
Mr. Anderson, my name
Hi.
is Darren Kettlehut, and you spoke at my daughter's 5th grade DARE graduation. You moved me so much. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous.
So am I, so that's okay.
You did a great job. We are very proud of you, and I have got to get that book. My daughter's a 6th grader this year at CD Folks.
What is it that she found out in the DARE graduation that you think was important?
I don't know for certain, except that he had 120 5th graders in the palm of his hand for about 20 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, what is DARE?
DARE is a National Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. We've kind of taken it a few steps better here in Williamson County, but it's basically a 17-week program where a police officer comes into a classroom and talks to the size of the classroom, the 20 or so kids, and forms a one-on-one relationship with them, teaching them about drugs and how to resist them. And we teach it in 5th grade because they're going to middle school the following year. I sort of coordinate the program, and I try to make as many of the graduations as possible. And that's basically why I wrote a children's book, because of the talking to those 5th graders.
How bad is the drug problem in that age group or in the age group following that in this area?
You know, we had a situation where teenage drug usage dropped so dramatically, so quickly, back in the early 90s, even the late 80s. And now we're starting to see some of that ground given back and erode to where we're starting to see more and more bad sets of statistics. I think we've probably gotten a handle on that, and it's the last year's statistics actually indicated it the upward trend had been reversed. But, you know, we have an advantage in drug education that we've never had before. And it's really incredible when you talk to the kids, because it's almost impossible for a kid growing up not to have a situation in their personal family where they've seen the ravages of drugs or alcohol or tobacco. And I made that statement once thinking, well, my family is different, and I have 2 boys. But when I thought about it some more, even within my family, which hasn't really had a tragedy with drugs, we've had a problem with alcohol. We've had a problem with tobacco. I mean, my boys had a favorite grandmother. And, you know, they know why she's dead. And it's I didn't mean to get off on that.
That's all right. That's all right. We'll take
We were
another
talking
call.
about Texas history.
Okay. Calhoun, Kentucky. That's next. You're next. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks for taking my call.
Certainly.
I wanted to ask Mr. Anderson a question. He just touched on something that I was interested in just a second ago. He did make a distinction between the 1920 Klan and the 1960 Klan. But I'm curious, did he make a distinction between those clans of those time periods and the original Klan that was formed in the 1860s? and also, did he make a distinction with the flag? And I'm referring to the Confederate battle flag that was flown by the Confederate soldiers, and making a distinction when they flew it as members of the Klan of the 1860s. And then in the 1920s, that flag was not part of their paraphernalia that they used. It only appeared sometime later. And I'm curious if he took the politically correct route, or did he make a distinction between these time periods? So,
I'm sorry, we lost him apparently. Sorry about that, caller. Go ahead.
Well, I only talked about 2 time periods because I wasn't given the right question to talk about 3 time periods, but obviously there were 3 clans in American history. One was the Reconstruction, basically Southern organization, very violent, very brutal, very short-lived, and then it died out about 1871, and there's a whole interesting segment of how that really brutal, awful group of Klansmen became transformed in American, especially Southern, but later on American thought, to where they were romanticized as somehow being heroes. And then you have the movie The Birth of a Nation that spread that nonsense nationwide. But the Klan has those 3 time periods, and the Reconstruction Klan, the 1920s Klan, and then what I call the Civil Rights Klan. And I don't pretend to be a historian who's an expert on any of those time periods, although I've tried to learn as much about the 1920s Klan as I could and needed to have the proper context for this book. But the 20s Klan is different than the 60s Klan and the Reconstruction Klan. It was a nationwide organization. It was just as popular in the North and the Midwest as it was in the South, and it wasn't totally, anti-black wasn't its only hate target. They hated anybody. And in fact, they instructed their collegials, we don't care who you hate, just whip up hate against whoever you can make the most money and get the most members off. And if the prejudice is against Jews, then be prejudiced against Jews. And if it's against Catholics or immigrants, do that. And if it's against blacks, do that. And if it's just mainly a law and order type thing, the 20s Klan would exploit that.
What's a district attorney do?
In Texas, the district attorney prosecutes felony criminal cases, so we do the more serious ones. And Moody started off as county attorney, which meant he did misdemeanor cases, and then he progressed to district attorney where he did the felony cases. So we basically do the murders, robberies, and rapes.
From here in Austin is the next call. Go ahead.
Mr. Anderson, this is Alba Eddy calling from locally here.
Mm-hmm.
And first I want to congratulate Hang'em Williamson County on the McDuff trial. That should have been done 30 years ago. And I say that to frame my next question, because I by no means claim to be a liberal or anything of that nature. But I'm just curious, my grandfather talked about the Klan. He was an organizer of the trade unions in Louisiana, and Catholic, and they had to have their brush-ups there. I'm just curious, in this current debate about morality with President Clinton's difficulties, and the way I wanted to frame this was, they keep talking about what his behavior is doing to our kids, and I agree. It's really not who I'd want to do what he did. But isn't there a bigger issue here with the CCC and some of the resurgence of some of these racial overtones that are coming from the right wing of the Republican Party, of which I happen to be a member?
Thanks, caller. Can you first explain to us from outside of here what that case is that he mentioned at the beginning?
Well, I'm not sure which case he was talking about. The McDuff case was actually tried in McLennan County and Travis County. It was a terrible case. It was a serial killer who had been released even though he'd been given the death sentence for a terrible murder back in the 1960s. And then he killed somewhere between 2 and 9 women when he was released in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And he was executed recently, but his execution was, or his crime spree is what led Texas to triple the size of its prison system and crack down on violent criminals, which is actually the subject of my last book.
I was going to ask you, my understanding from your biography is that you have several other books out on criminal issues specifically tied to Texas, or not?
Yes. I've tried to explain Texas criminal law to one practitioner's in a heavily footnoted 600-page treatise.
What's the name of the book?
That book is called Texas Sentencing, but then I've also gone and tried to explain it to those who provide services to crime victims in a book called Texas Crime Victims Handbook. And then I tried to explain it to a general audience in a book called Crime in Texas, Your Complete Guide to the Texas Criminal Justice System. And I noticed 2 segments ago you had my editor, Theresa May,
Yes.
on there, and I certainly hope she mentioned Crime in Texas. If she didn't, she'll get a call Monday.
Is it a fairly new book, or is it one you've had?
It came out in '97.
How has criminal justice in Texas changed over the past 5 years?
Well, criminal justice, if we go back 7 years ago, we had the worst revolving door of any state in the union in terms of we had a prison system that held 42,000 people. In 1 year, we released 59,000 criminals, which meant that none of them, or very few of them, were serving more than a year. And if their sentence was less than 10 years, they actually didn't go to prison. They stayed in the county jail. We had a 79% parole approval rate, and we had the crime rate that went with it. I mean, everybody in Texas was thinking that, you know, we're safer than the Northeast, but then 1 year the statistics came out and showed that Dallas, Houston, Travis County, Austin, and San Antonio were 4 of the most violent cities in the United States, and it was largely because we couldn't hold people in prison. And when McDuff got released and finally got caught, and everybody realized very painfully what this man had done and how there was no way this man should have been released, that focused public attention, and we doubled the amount of time violent criminals have to serve, and we took a prison system that had 42,000 beds, which was large, and made it a prison system with 145,000 beds, which is the 3rd largest in the world.
Ken Anderson is a Texas district attorney, or a district attorney in Texas, I should say, and he is the author of this book, which is meant for 10 to 14-year-olds. You Can't Do That, Dan Moody. We're talking about that as well as some of his other publications that he's written on the Texas criminal justice system. Next call, Glendale, California. You're next. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, and congratulations, Mr. Moody, on an excellent book. I am calling to say that I worked in Texas doing a movie for Walt Disney in Austin, and I am so impressed with the Texans. They're impressive people. They're very smart, and I didn't know what to expect when I first got down there, and hearing that the Klan, which is not respected here in Glendale, and I like to say in Chicago, where I was born. I don't know about the Klan. I think they're cowards.
Thanks, caller. Any response?
Well, I usually refer to them, at least with children's groups, as bozos in bed sheets. Certainly anybody who has their thoughts is the kind of person you would expect to be a coward, and the incidents I relate in my story certainly are incredible acts of cowardness. And it was amazing once the first conviction was obtained, how all the Klansmen who had lied to the grand jury came out of the woodwork or out from under their rocks to come tell Dan Moody about what had really happened. And a case that was extremely difficult to prosecute initially, he ultimately ended up convicting a preacher, a Klan organizer, of perjury based upon a whole bunch of Klansmen who came and wanted to cooperate after the first one got sent to prison. And in the book I refer to it as the fourth trial, the perjury trial, as being Justice Klan number 101 because he literally was able to use 8 Klansmen who violated their oath of secrecy, which was one of the Klan's main tenets, to get a conviction. And that's one of the reasons why Moody, in the series of convictions, was able to break the back of the Klan in Texas, because he not only got a conviction and a prison sentence on the first case, which was extremely important because nobody anywhere in the country had done that, and then get 2 more convictions, but the fourth conviction, he used Klansmen to testify against the Klan preacher to get the perjury conviction, which was a brilliant step on his part, but it really is what shook the Klan to its foundations in Texas, and ultimately in the 1924 elections, they lost their political power because of what Moody had done.
We're live from Book People. It's an independent bookstore in Austin, Texas, as part of our coverage on Book TV this weekend. Next call, Detroit, Michigan.
Yes, I'm really impressed with your guest in terms of reaching young people with a book like that. And I would like to know how prevalent is the Klan mentality in the Senate and the Congress today? And also, is the group the CCC, is this just a cute way of expressing the mentality of the KKK?
Mr. Anderson.
I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on hate or hate crimes or the current hate groups. I know there's quite a proliferation of hate groups and small groups, and now with the internet, you seem to be able to, they seem to be able to spread themselves around with information much more readily than they ever have been before. What I see when I go talk to kids, though, is that what we've done over the last 30 years, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who would disagree with this, but nonetheless, I see just a really positive effect of what's happened over the last 30 years since the Civil Rights Act was signed by President Johnson. I see a lot less prejudice amongst kids and a lot of really positive things, and not just the elementary school kids where you might expect that, but going on into the middle school and high school ages.
This is published by whom?
It's published by Aiken Press here in Austin.
Just spelled E-A-K-I-N.
E-A-K-I-N.
How can someone outside, since this is mostly a Texas story, can you buy this book outside of Texas?
It can be bought outside of Texas. Obviously, the easiest way would be through one of the online booksellers. Of the 2 major ones, one seems to have it available for 2 to 3 day delivery, and I noticed that I was topping their charts under children's biography, race relations the other day. And the other
You can
one,
go ahead and say which one it was.
Oh, it was Barnes & Noble. And Amazon.com, which sold more of my other books, says it's on 4 to 6 week delivery. So I would definitely think that Barnes & Noble would be the quicker delivery.
Los Angeles, you're next. Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead. You're on the air, sir.
Hello. Am I on the air?
Yes, you are.
Mr. Anderson, I very much admire what you've done here. This is a shock to me. I had a father involved. He was a preacher. The ceremony was described to me by my eldest brother about such a thing taking place in Uvalde, Texas. Are you aware of what went on there? Do you know who really killed Levy Old? Do you remember Hammer Johnson and the forces trying to make the county wet? The involvement of not John Nance Garner himself, perhaps, but there was a terrible thing that went on there in the 20s, long just before I was born.
Well, that certainly would fit with what I was able to find out, I wasn't able to research every community's history with the Klan, but the 1920s Klan in Texas and really nationwide was obviously an extremely potent political force. It was secret, and it was violent. Typically, their violence was recorded in the newspaper, but their violence tended to follow a pattern, which was if they decided they didn't like you for whatever reason, they would deliver a warning to you. And if you left town, then they would be successful. And I suspect most people did leave town. But for those who didn't, they would get beaten, tarred, and feathered, and occasionally murdered. And that happened literally hundreds and probably thousands of times throughout the country. The amazing thing was that the common denominator of those cases was that nobody was ever convicted of any of those crimes until it happened in Georgetown, Texas in 1923. And what happened specifically that I've written about was an incident where a traveling salesman was warned by the Klan to leave town. And as I'm sure there were tens of thousands of people who heeded those warnings, he was one of the ones who didn't. And he had been a veteran of World War I, and he didn't think that there was any reason for him to fight in Europe to make Europe free from Kaiser Wilhelm, and at the same time have to come back here and kowtow to the Ku Klux Klan. So being a traveling salesman and young and impetuous, he went around the local communities saying, I've been warned to leave by the Ku Klux Klan. And I'll tell you what I think of the Klan. I'll kill the first 21 Ku Kluxes that try to make me leave. Well, you can imagine that the Klan wasn't very excited about that thought, and they didn't even bother with 21. They just sent 10. And they ambushed him on an Easter Sunday afternoon, and they pulled him from a car he was driving with 3 passengers, and they pistol whipped him on the side of the road. Then they kidnapped him and took him 10 miles down the road, where they tied him up to a tree which was part of a barbed wire fence line, and took a lash and began to lash him. There was some discussion whether they should kill him, and ultimately they decided to let him live as a message to anybody else. Then they took him from there to downtown Taylor to the City Hall Square, which was at that time a magnificent building, the most public place in town. They chained him to a tree and they poured the tar on him, and I don't know why, but they must have been out of feathers that day because he didn't get the feathers. And at that point you had a terribly shocking act of Klan violence, but that was what had happened hundreds and thousands of times all over the country, and there was no difference. The only difference was that the sheriff, Lee Allen, actually investigated the crime and got a hold of the district attorney, Dan Moody, and they went and actually called 100 witnesses to the grand jury, most of whom committed perjury, almost all of whom were Klansmen, but were able to identify 3 of the 10 Klansmen and got a grand jury to return an indictment. And so in September of 1923, this young district attorney took this case to trial. And it was a focus of a considerable newspaper attention. I like to call it the O.J. Simpson trial of the 1920s. And everybody was there to see Dan Moody get beat, because there was nobody who had any reason to think he could get a conviction against the Ku Klux Klan. And after the trial went 7 days into the second week on a Tuesday, they had a day worth of final arguments. Moody concluded his case at shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, and that was the jury went out, and everybody assumed the jury would deliberate for a little while, and then they'd come back the next day to begin their serious deliberations. And Moody had actually broken out the dominoes, waiting to find out when the jury was going to recess for the night. And the knock came on the door, and there was a verdict, and within 20 minutes the verdict had been arrived at, and the courtroom was packed. There were 400 pairs of eyes looking at that jury foreman when he stood up and he read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Murray Jackson, guilty, and sentence him to 5 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law. That was unheard of, and it was in all the press all over the country. It was an amazing thing. That verdict sent shockwaves through the Klan. The Klan's reaction was one of total defiance. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks later, they held Ku Klux Klan Day at the State Fair of Texas in Dallas and had 75,000 people show up. But Moody, realizing that he had scored a victory but hadn't knocked the Klan out, went on to get his 2 more convictions. And then when all the Klansmen were afraid of the perjury that they'd get sent to prison, he got them to testify to another grand jury and got the indictment against the preacher. And that was a case where everybody was involved. If you can imagine, Klan preacher on trial was not just a local Georgetown, a local Texas story. This was nationwide. And again, the eyes of the nation were focused on Moody in 1924 in the courthouse in Georgetown. And when that verdict came down with again a conviction and again a prison sentence, the Klan knew it was in trouble.
Pittsburgh, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I'm calling just to say a comment on the book. I've read the book, and I'm impressed that we have individuals that are in public service and are still committed to showing young people who true heroes are in our lifetime, not individuals that make huge amounts of money and in the public eye so much as sport and entertainment figures, but people that stand up to really eradicate prejudice and hatred. And I was impressed with this book. Hard reading sometimes because of the descriptiveness of the violence. But I really believe that we need to keep in young people's minds that this was ugly and this happened, and it was real, and it will continue in our lifetime unless we realize the depth of this.
Thanks, Pittsburgh. Did you follow Mr. Moody's career into the governorship in this book, or does it stop with the end of the trial?
Well, let me just comment on the caller. First of all, I'm always happy to hear from anybody from Pittsburgh because it's been a lot of years since I've been there, and I am a naturalized Texan, much like Sam Houston was, but I was born in Oakmont, Pennsylvania, which is just down the Allegheny River. So I think she's off the phone now, so I can't pursue that. But anyway, your question was that I follow him into the governor's office.
Does the book follow him into the governor's office here, or does it stop?
It does. It stops after he's elected, or after he completes his term as governor. But what was key was after Moody had gotten his 4 convictions, the Klan, nonetheless, having won the 22 elections, was prepared to take over the state government in 1924. And they ran a slate of candidates for every statewide office. And they used what we call an elimination primary, which basically was a convention, where whoever won the majority at the Klan elimination primary, all the Klansmen pledged to support that candidate. And by doing that, their entire block of votes went into one person's column. That person, and back in those days, it was not unusual to have 8 or 10 semi-major candidates running for a political office. So the whole trick was to be one of the top vote getters to get into the runoff. Well, what happened was the Klan had enough power left after those convictions that they, through their elimination primary, had a candidate run for every statewide office who made the runoff. Moody ran for state attorney general, and he won, and barely missed 50%, winning outright. But he also got into a runoff with a Klansman. And so the Texans had a clear decision to make. Are we going to vote for the Klan slate, or are we going to vote for the other candidates who weren't Klans people, including Dan Moody? Well, Moody had so changed public opinion that what was a foregone conclusion, or the conventional wisdom a year earlier, that those Klan candidates would be the winner, turned out that none of them won. Moody had the largest vote of the non-Klan candidates and was elected Attorney General. The interesting thing, however, was in the governor's race. Even though there were several good candidates, the governor's race turned out the top 2 vote getters were the Klan candidate and a lady named Ma Ferguson. Now, Ma Ferguson is an interesting story in and of herself, but her husband, Jim Ferguson, had been governor in the teens and had been impeached and removed from office for some pretty severe corruption. He had tried to get back into office and finally gave up, realizing that he was barred from life for holding public office in Texas. And he had announced that his wife, Miriam, was going to run for governor, but he hadn't told his wife. He just made this announcement, went home and told her, and she decided she'd run. But she didn't make any of the speeches, and nobody was confused about who really was going to run and hold office. So ultimately, Texans were faced with these Klan candidates and basically good candidates, including Moody, being the non-Klan candidates, except in the governor's race. And they had to make a decision. Do we want to elect a Klansman, or do we want to elect Ma Ferguson and get Jim back into power, even though he stole his blind the first time he was governor? And what Moody told the newspapers he was going to do is what a lot of Texans did. They held their nose, they voted for Ma Ferguson, and they hoped for the best. Well, she won by a lot less votes than Dan Moody, because a lot of people weren't willing to put Jim Ferguson back into power. And she became governor, and it did work out well for the first 15 minutes, but then she went back to the mansion and took a nap, and Jim Ferguson began to steal the state blind again. And he stole it blind in every way he could. Now, Dan Moody, having just battled the Ku Klux Klan and basically knocked them out as a power in Texas, was the youngest attorney general in the history of our state, and he's faced with the most corrupt administration you could imagine. One of the things the Fergusons did was they let a bunch of paving contracts out, some $30 million worth of road paving contracts, because cars were then becoming important and we needed paved roads. When they let those contracts out, all the juicy ones went to companies that were formed the day before the bids. They were awarded to the highest bidder, and they were all cronies of the Fergusons. they were let out at triple the going rate for paving. When Moody discovered this, he went to court and got the contracts canceled. Now, there was a big battle with the Fergusons, and they took issue with whether or not he could even represent the state of Texas in these battles. But he ultimately won, and he got the paving contracts canceled, and he went to Kansas City and Dallas and literally brought back $1 million in cash and securities that the Fergusons had stolen and deposited in the Texas Treasury. And that set up a really incredible battle in the 26th election, when Moody, being the logical person to run for governor, although many people thought he was too young, ran against Ma Ferguson, and in a crowded field, they got into a runoff, and the public had to make a decision. Did they want this young whippersnapper to be their governor, or did they want the corruption of the Fergusons? And interestingly enough, the suffragettes of the day, the ones who had won the battle for women's suffrage in Texas, and incidentally, women voted in Texas 2 years before they did in the rest of the country, but those suffragettes, almost to a woman, supported Dan Moody over Ma Ferguson. She was not a friend of the suffragettes. She was, as a matter of fact, opposed to women's suffrage.
Washington, D.C., you're next. Hello.
Hi, Ken. This is Greg Laughlin from West Columbia calling from Washington, D.C.
Hello, Congressman.
How are you?
I'm fine.
I want to compliment you for your continuing efforts to help the young people, and I was struck by the caller from Round Rock's comments about your participation in DARE program, and I hope the listeners nationwide become more aware of it. I have a question on it and then a second question. I recall one time participating with you in the DARE program in Georgetown, and I saw how the children in the DARE program reacted to law enforcement people such as yourself, police officers, sheriff's deputies were there. I wonder if you could relate to us your experience since those years of surrounding communities who do not have such a program conducted by the law enforcement people, whether their drug statistics by young people is higher than that in Williamson County, where you lead a very successful program, what the statistics are in that, if you know. And secondly, since you've written this great tribute to Governor Moody, I wonder if you could comment, if he were alive today, what social injustices or powerful groups such as the Ku Klux Klan of the 20s that exist today in the 90s, would he attack or stand up to as he did in the 20s? And I saw the grin on your face about his political affiliation in the 20s, and if you'd care to comment on that in view of the people that have shown conscience in switch parties in Williamson County in the 90s. Good luck, Ken.
Congressman, that's so many questions, I don't even know where to start.
And that was whom?
That was Congressman Greg Laughlin, former Congressman Greg Laughlin. Moody obviously embodied certain core values: truth, honesty, a belief in the American jury system and the American system of jurisprudence. And I've often wondered how anybody, as a young county attorney, could throw a Kliegel, back in 1920s, could throw a Kliegel out of his office. That must have been an act of incredible courage. And there's no reason to think he knew they were coming. So there was something about his value system that so made him not worry about the political consequences. He didn't tell the Kliegel to come back tomorrow. He didn't say, well, let me think about it. He just threw him out of his office. And that today we say, well, how could you make any other decision? But for somebody who obviously was politically ambitious, back in the 1920s, as powerful as the Klan was, to have the courage, but also to have the values to know that the Klan was just not something that was American. One of the things that I try to talk about that's not really mentioned in the book is when I was doing the research, I was reading a lot of newspaper accounts at the time. I read many newspapers, and I tried to read a lot of what else was going on. And one of the things I realized was that this hate group, the Ku Klux Klan, that spread this incredibly rabid nationalism, 100% white Americanism, was opposed to everybody who was different from them. You look at the same